So I hope everybody is doing well. Today what I want to do is finish up our economic unit by looking at two kind of related trends, and one is to look at debt and the other is to look at the rise of Africa. Before I get going on our topic today, I just wanted to remind you that for breakouts today, we have two identical documents that you'll be working on, but groups 1 through 9 will work on one document, and groups 10 through 18 will work on the other. And hopefully that will solve the issue of having a lot of editors with the breakout session questions open. So if you haven't yet, in the next couple of minutes, please go to our geography class folder and open up the breakout questions. Make sure you open up the breakout questions that are pertain to your groups. And then when we do go to breakout sessions today, please nominate one person to be your note taker for each group, right? Rather than having multiple people try and write on the document from your group. I'll also ask you, in that same folder where the breakout questions are, you'll also see another PDF called UN Report on Commodity Dependence, which is a UN, which we're going to use to answer one of the questions. And it's the same link as it's always been for the Google folder, so you should have access to it easily. And really, as we go through the rest of the semester, that's just a folder you should always open up when we start class. And then finally, I encourage you to open up the World Bank World Development Indicators. You're not going to make a graph, so don't worry about it. I'm just going to ask you to look at data and get a sense of what's going on with your country. Okay, so that's going to be the last part of class, but I did want to let you know that there are a couple of things that you want to get prepared for before I send you to breakout sessions. Okay. So today what I want to do is I want to turn our attention, in our economic unit, we've looked at a couple of key trends. We've looked at, for example, the rise of China as an industrial economic superpower, and we've looked at particularly issues around poverty in the Global South. Today I'm going to finish up by looking at the Global South, and we're going to look at two other big trends that have really impacted and continue to impact what is going on in the Global South. And one is dealing with the legacy of debt, and the other is economic growth outside of India and China. And we're going to look at the rise of the African lion economies. So one of the interesting things that begins to happen in the 1960s, so way back, we're going to take a time machine and go way back in time. 1960s and 1970s, many countries in the Global South begin to take out loans. And they do this for a few reasons. First, they don't have a whole lot of capital or money at their disposal, right? This is 60s and 70s. Most of these countries are primarily agricultural in their economies, so primary sector dominates these economies. And there is a sense that one of the ways to become a stronger economy and to reap the benefits of a stronger economy, i.e. higher quality of life, reduced food insecurity, enhanced well-being and human health, is to develop an industrial economy, to make that transition from primary to secondary sector. And so one of the ways to do that is, for many countries, was to take out loans in order to build the infrastructure that you needed to create a secondary sector in your economy. Okay, so what happens is many countries begin to use the World Bank, but other private institutions as well, to take out loans. And I'm not talking about millions, I'm talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Because if you think about it, building a highway that is going to crisscross your country, or building port facilities so that you can ship things into the global economy, or to build hospitals and schools and to modernize, we're not talking about a few $1,000s or even a few million. We're talking about hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, right? So governments are taking out loans, And for the most part, there is an environment, a global economic environment that is very encouraging around loans, that many institutions, including the World Bank, feel that this is a way to really see economic growth in the global South. So many countries in Latin America take out loans, so too in Southeast Asia, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. And so this is just a graph showing you, for example, the debt that Argentina begins to accumulate starting in the 1970s, when this becomes a more pronounced trend. And we see, for example, that the trend is to kind of see this escalating amount of debt that is being accrued throughout pretty much the 70s and 80s. And this is important because this is what is driving some of the transition and transformation of many global South economies. But it's also happening within the context of the global economy. And so by the 1980s, there's a bit of an economic problem. Globally, there's a bit of a recession, and this triggers some problems with the beginnings of a debt crisis in the global South. So just to give you a perspective on debt, all global South debt combined is about $2 trillion. Now that is a lot of money. However, it's actually a small percentage of all of the total world debt. I'm going to be introducing the 40 highly indebted poor countries in just a few minutes, but before I do that, their cumulative debt is about 200 billion. So even significantly less than what we're seeing in the total global South. And just to put that in perspective, the US national debt is $22 trillion and counting. I think it was $22 trillion back in like the fall of 2020. So it significantly continues to increase. And I think there's actually a national debt clock that you can Google, and it'll tick over the money as it's increasing. So I want to give you this perspective because, first of all, debt is really important in terms of understanding some of the struggles that have happened because of debt, but also to put debt in a perspective of, many countries take out debt, including the United States. We float bond measures, we sell treasury notes, right? These, in a sense, are debt. So Natalie says the U.S. debt is now 28 trillion. Okay, yeah, it keeps going up. Yeah, trillion is like a really hard number to wrap my head around, right? So the reason why I wanted to kind of put the perspective on debt is because we've heard about debt a lot. We've heard about it more recently in the context of some of our European countries struggling, like Greece and Portugal and even Ireland have struggled a bit with debt. The debt crisis in Greece was about 400 billion, right? So the total number of debt that countries are dealing with was significant, but also a small part of the debt that has been accruing over time. So many economists began to talk about this concept of the debt burden. Particularly in the lowest of our income countries, what economists began to worry about was that even a small number of dollars taken out in debt could cripple economic growth and development in some of our lowest income countries, right? And so by the 1990s, some of the promises of debt, of taking out loans in the first place, were not being realized. Particularly in countries like Sub-Saharan Africa that had taken out debt, they were not really seeing a transition to a robust secondary economy and all of the benefits that would entail. And in fact, many of our indebted poor countries, those countries on the lowest income levels, were seeing higher rates of infant mortality, right? That's not a good thing. They were seeing higher rates of disease and illiteracy and malnutrition than other countries in the global South or the developing world. And so economists began to talk about the debt burden. And that the idea of a debt burden is that it doesn't really matter how much money you've taken out in total. If you've taken out $100 million or $4 billion or $4 trillion, if you cannot pay that money back, it is a burden on your country's economy. It is a burden on growth and development. When we think about debt, and I'll return to this previous slide, right, where we're talking about some debt in the global south being only a few billion dollars, and I know a few billion dollars is still a lot, but in the global scheme of things, many countries had less than, several $100 million or maybe $1 billion worth of debt, and it was starting to cripple economic growth. And in part, it was starting to cripple economic growth because the money was flowing in the wrong direction, right? So global south countries take out money in order to industrialize and modernize. For many countries, they don't begin to see those transformations in their economy, and yet they're still being asked every quarter to pay back debt repayment. Well, if your economy isn't seeing the growth that you hoped when you took out the debt, it means that you're paying back money. So your money is flowing from the global south to banks in the global north, and your economy is not growing at a rate that is exceeding your debt repayments. And so economists began to discuss the idea that for many of the lowest income countries where the burden of debt was significant, that was where their economies were not really growing in a way that would allow them to easily make their debt payments, that this was preventing countries from being able to invest in human development, from being able to, say, invest in better healthcare systems or expand educational systems, right? And so many experts at the World Bank and economists in other venues like academics began to talk about debt burden and the idea that we needed to reform debt, particularly in the poorest countries. So we're still back in our time machine. We're going to go back to 2000, right? And 2000 is an important year. Remember that in 2000, we launched the Millennium Development Goals. We also saw a really big international conversation around debt and debt burden and development. So 1999 or so, we get a lot of international leaders coming together to discuss debt. And in particular, what emerges is a list of 40 poorest countries and what the trajectory of debt repayment for these 40 poorest countries would look like. So these are our lowest income countries. And the question economists were asking is, how long is it going to take, to pay back debt and for these countries to reach $900 per capita, which would take them out of dire poverty, right? And so if you can see, some countries were kind of like on the 25-year plan, right? That's not good. So countries like Sudan and Lesotho, some countries were in the 25 to 50 years, like a Mozambique or a Bangladesh. Some countries were in the 100-year payback range, right? Imagine a country that takes out just $1 billion in loan is going to spend 50 years paying this back, and they still are going to take 50 years to reach, poverty or just slightly above poverty average incomes. One of the most stark and kind of troubling columns is the one where it wasn't really clear that these countries were ever going to be able to get out of debt, even within a century of economic growth and development, right? And so these became the 40 poorest countries. And it was thought that perhaps we really needed to rethink debt for these 40 poorest countries, right? Because the idea of taking out debt was to improve quality of life, improve economic growth. And it was clear that for many countries, this was not happening, right? So as we're starting to rethink development and how to create sustainable development, there's also a reckoning with the idea that debt was inhibiting much of what we wanted to achieve around sustainable development. Leslie, you asked from whom do they take the loans? Well, remember I mentioned the World Bank was one place where they would take out loans, but a lot of private banks, like Capital One, there were a lot of private banks that had, you know, because of growth in the economy, there was a lot of money, right? And banks love to take your money, and then they love to loan money. And governments are considered pretty good loan risks, right? Like, unlike an individual that can maybe disappear, change their name, and try and run away from debt, countries can't run away from debt, right? So, you know, governments take out loans, and we know where those countries are, and so banks can, you know, get back their money. So, you know, we're talking about British banks, U.S. banks, Japanese banks began to loan money. Also, there was a lot of money in the 1970s and 1980s starting to trickle in, not just from the strong performance of US and European economies, but also from the growth, particularly of oil exporting countries. You know, countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela began to export quite a lot of oil and to make a lot of money. And so most people who were making money in the oil economy, they weren't investing in their own countries. They were putting their money in, you know, HSBC Bank. And so there were billions of dollars, they call them petrodollars, sitting in banks. And of course, banks only make money when they loan out money, right? So like, they want your money, but your money actually doesn't really sit. Like, it's not just sitting in the bank. Banks take in your money and you have a savings account, and but your money is kind of taken and then it's like loaned out, and they're charging interest rates, right? So if you have a credit card, you know what I mean by interest rates, right? You charge something on your credit card, and if you can't pay it off in full, that's okay, right? That's what the credit card is for. It's called credit. But you will pay a percentage, a finance charge on whatever it is you don't pay back that month. And that can accrue over time, right? Same as when you take out any kind of loan. If you take out a mortgage loan to buy a house, for example, right now I think the mortgage percentage for most housing is somewhere around 2.5% to 3%, which doesn't sound like very much, but it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars depending on the total cost of your house. Back in the 70s and 80s, interest rates were much higher than they are right now. And so that meant that paying back loans took a lot more money. So if you have to pay back if there's a 10% payback, that's a much more amount that you're paying if you can't pay the debt all at once. And of course, countries were taking out millions and billions of dollars in loans. They weren't going to be able to pay them off in the first quarter. These are long-term 20, 30-year loans. And so every month or every quarter, they might have, you know, $50 million due. And of that $50 million, maybe some of that would be towards the principal of the loan, but a lot would be, in a sense, the finance charge, the interest rates, right? So if your economy begins to maybe stagnate or not grow in the same way, then debt repayment becomes a problem. So when you have a chance, view this about a 10-minute video about the impact that debt begins to have on Africa, and in particular, I think it takes a look at Ghana. So all of this debt begins to impact sub-Saharan Africa. If you remember, something like 32 out of the 40 most in-debt countries were in sub-Saharan Africa. And if we take a look at the United Nations Human Development Report, or HDI, the most recent report, 30 out of the 32 countries that are classified as low human development are located in sub-Saharan Africa. So what has been some of the challenges for sub-Saharan Africa to deal with? Well, first, they have a disease burden where the impact of diseases of all sorts, of things like yellow fever and cholera, but also the HIV/AIDS pandemic and tuberculosis and malaria, they all have undercut labor productivity and human health, right? So one So this is what Jeffrey Sachs, who's one of the architects behind the Sustainable Development Goals and who we've read some articles from before, really talked about the disease burden has been significant in many sub-Saharan African countries. Another challenge to sub-Saharan Africa's growth is the challenges of debt and debt dependency, and aid dependency as well. So several countries in the region are receiving aid at more than $50 per capita, but their GNP or their GDP per capita is only about $350, right? So one of the things that's happening is that there is official development in assistance that comes from various United Nations organizations plus World Bank, plus what countries contribute to official development assistance, like the United States contributes a certain amount every year. That amounts to about $26 billion every year, and that is a significant amount. But sub-Saharan African countries are currently spending about $31 billion each year on debt repayment, right? So again, the money's kind of flowing in the wrong direction if we want to be seeing tremendous economic growth. If we're only providing $26 billion a year in development assistance to build things like roads and schools and hospitals, but countries in sub-Saharan Africa are basically sending to banks $31 billion a year in debt repayment, then that flow is that strange flow is really impacting economic growth. One measure of the challenges of debt is the percentage of what they earn through exports as a percentage of their debt. And most economists say if a country is spending 25% of their export earnings to pay off debt, that this is the wrong direction of money flowing. And this is unlikely to get a country out of debt anytime soon. So this made many people feel by the year 2000 that sub-Saharan Africa was really linked in the global economy more through the flow of financial aid and debt repayment than it was through the actual creation of goods that were generating income and growth in the global economy, right? So this was another challenge for sub-Saharan Africa. Two more challenges that I want to talk about. One is a concept called commodity dependence. I think I've introduced that before, but if not, it was definitely in the readings for today. And commodity dependence is the result of an economy that is not very diverse. In other words, commodity dependence is largely an economy in a country that maybe is exporting one or two or three or four things that really is the bedrock of all economic growth for that country. That's all their exports. And of course, when we're talking about commodities, we're talking about primary sector products. So we're talking about anything agricultural, so food, sugar, bananas, those are commodities. We're also talking about minerals, so tin, iron, nickel, silver, gold. And we're also talking about oil. So Andrew asks, is this the same as a resource curse? Sort of. Some countries don't have certain kinds of resources like oil or diamonds that can also be a problem. And then some countries have the curse of having just one resource that is highly valued. And what it can mean is that essentially you're very dependent on this one or two or three commodities, but it means that you're also highly vulnerable to price changes, to economic shocks. For example, Nigeria has tremendous commodity dependence on oil, right? But those oil prices have been pretty volatile in the last 10 years. They tend to go up, they tend to crash, they tend to go up again, and then they crash, right? And that is not particularly a good way to see your economy try and grow in a steady way if you've got these, dramatic shifts and changes in prices. So that the lack of diversification in an economy, as well as being vulnerable to swings in international prices and even international demand, can make a commodity-dependent country really not see the kind of growth and development that they would necessarily see if they had a far more diverse economy. Another challenge that plagues out sub-Saharan Africa is a lack of infrastructure. And this is not, this is a lack of infrastructure in many ways. It is roads and bridges, it is port facilities, but it's also things like information technologies and communication technology, as well as energy. Reliable energy systems are a big inhibitor for economic growth. And so when we think about some of the Sustainable Development Goals, many of them focus, or at least SDG 9 SDG 9 focuses on infrastructure and as a really important part of what it will take to help with economic growth. And then last, one of the things that has been true for some of our lowest income countries is the lack of foreign direct investment. And maybe many of you already found that when we were working on assignment number 3, that your country did not have the same level, say, of foreign direct investment that a China has, or a Brazil, or a Mexico, right? So some of our higher performing economies in the global south have had far more foreign direct investment. And there are many reasons for some of this lack of foreign direct investment in sub-Saharan Africa. One is that there has been some political instability in some of these countries, and wherever you have political instability, you're not going to have foreign direct investment, right? Because private companies are not going to want to risk investment in a country where the politics are unstable, where you can't necessarily count on the agreements that you're making, or that where violence or chaos or the potential threat of civil war or war and conflict in general is going to really make your investment vulnerable. So that has also been true in other regions of the world. So wherever you see conflict, like in Afghanistan, or you see high levels of government corruption, or just political almost incompetency, like say in a Haiti, you're going to see a lack of foreign direct investment. So those are some of the challenges that sub-Saharan Africa has had to face as it's come into the 21st century. So let's turn to rethinking approaches to debt, because sub-Saharan Africa has certainly struggled with debt. So has Latin America. Some parts of Southeast Asia, even our Asian tigers, have had issues with debt in the past. So again, going back to 2000, we had a whole lot of international conversations around debt, and Bill Gates got involved, as did Bono from U2. So it kind of became a celebrity cause of the year. And there were some protests at World Bank meetings about needing to reform debt and how to especially address debt in the lowest income countries. So the World Bank and the IMF rethink the debt of especially the 40 poorest countries, and they launched this new project in 2000 or late 1999 called the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, or HIPC project. The idea behind the HIPC project was to provide debt relief and low interest rate loans to cancel the existing higher interest rate loan debt repayment. So what the World Bank essentially and the HIPC fund did was it provided interim debt relief in the initial stages, and then when the country began to make its commitments on debt repayment, it canceled the debt. So it wasn't a complete canceling of debt. It wasn't like, your parents come in and they say, don't worry about that credit card, I'm going to pay it all for you. That's not exactly what happened. So how did it work? So what the fund did was it basically said that a country, instead of paying back the loans to the World Bank, had to instead invest that money in infrastructure or education or health. And if they invested the amount of money that they would have paid in debt repayments over, say, a 3 or 5 or 6 year term, whatever term they negotiated, then that part of the debt would be forgiven, right? So in other words, instead of sending that money to a bank as repayment, they had to invest that same amount of repayments in something that would essentially enhance development in that country, right? So here are the 40 poorest countries. This is the map of the HIPC countries that were in the initial project, and you can see that most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, although we do have a few like Honduras and Nicaragua and Bolivia and Guyana in Central and South America, and we also have Myanmar or Burma, as well as Vietnam and Laos in Southeast Asia. And these are where some of the countries are today. So many of the green countries are countries that have participated in the HIPC initiative and are now have gone through the process of investing debt repayment in their own country instead, and now have completed the debt program. So they're free of the debt burden, right? And countries in red are those where they've applied to the program. And although this is a slightly older map, it's 2018. So it's possible that these are countries that are currently going through the HIPC program. So what are some of the results? Well, the good thing is that we have seen some positive results come out of the debt program. For example, in Ghana, their savings from their HIPC funds helped to provide microcredit, right, which is like credit that's under $1,000 or $2,000, to about 43,000 farmers. They funded 563 sanitation projects and 141 clean water projects. And the money that they would have sent as debt repayment also was invested in and contributed to the construction of 500 new classrooms for an education, right? And then 2 other countries that have gone through the HIPC project include Malawi, where they had about $3 billion in debt. And by 2006, so they did a 6-year HIPC project, right? So they took that $3 billion, or they took their debt repayment on that $3 billion. And over that 6 years, they invested in a variety of projects in the country, and then they received debt relief. And then Sierra Leone also entered the project in 2002 with about $1.7 billion in debt, and they completed it in 2006, so about 4 years. And although they had some good success at investing into things that were desperately needed in their country, one of the controversial aspects was that they did privatize their public utilities like water, electricity, and telecommunications. And there's some criticism about privatizing public utilities, particularly in low-income countries. A lot of times the privatization of things like water is a real problem because the rich can afford clean water, the poor cannot. And so oftentimes privatizing those public utilities creates more problems for the poor, who oftentimes are not able to afford the clean water or access to electricity. So there has been some criticism of the HIPC projects, but on the other hand, it has helped many of these countries come out of debt. So to kind of summarize, you guys can watch this short video that talks about the debt relief and some of the problems, for example, that Guyana faced in the 1980s, and then the benefits that came from them for participating in the HIPC program. Okay, in the last 10 minutes, I want to focus a little bit on Africa emerging, right? So to move beyond the burden of debt and to look at what has happened to Africa really post 2010. So much of what I've talked about in terms of challenges and debt were really in the early 2000s. And of course, what I want to do is kind of bring us up to speed in terms of looking at what's been happening in the last few years. And many economists are now referring to the African economies is the rise of the lions, right? So with uh, with the Southeast Asian countries, we saw the rise of the tigers and the Chinese dragon. Now we're seeing the lions of Africa emerge. So what have been some of the growth and investment trends? Well, there's still a lot of official development assistance going on in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Primarily, the US has been involved through USAID projects that have stimulated growth and investment in things like infrastructure and clean water, and to some degree school buildings of schools. There's also been the increase in public and private investment, particularly because of the Sustainable Development Goals of the last 5 years or so, right? So a real interest in attempting to do some innovative projects in the private sphere around sustainable development. And then remember I talked about China's Belt and Road Initiative and how there's quite a large investment in several African countries like Kenya, for example. There has been some private sector or foreign direct investment coming in that is looking at opportunities for resource extraction in particular. So the United States has played a role in helping to create a buzz or conditions that would increase foreign direct investment and also official development investment. So in partnership with USAID, actually, the private sector and USAID, which of course is a federal agency, there's been about $100 billion of investment in sub-Saharan Africa around energy, agricultural production, and industrialization. So let's take a quick look at energy. So if you remember, SDG 7 is clean and affordable energy. One of the challenges for Africa has been a lack of electricity. Remember, one of the challenges that I mentioned just a few minutes ago was the lack of infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, but also electrical systems. And of course, most economies run on electricity and need electricity. And so things like rolling brownouts or blackouts, because you just don't have sufficient energy supply to meet demand, has been a real challenge for many sub-Saharan African countries. It was estimated that about 3/4 of sub-Saharan Africans did not have access to reliable electricity back in 2015. So one of the goals of USAID's Project Power Africa has been to bring 60 million African residents into have electrical connections and to be generating about 30,000 megawatts of new and clean power. So solar, wind, hydroelectric, but mostly solar and wind investments in sub-Saharan Africa, because that's kind of, sub-Saharan Africa does have quite a lot of sunshine, and so the opportunities around solar have been seen as potentially very promising. So USAID has generated quite a lot of investment in the countries highlighted in yellow on the map, where they have invested in electrical systems and electrical infrastructure, right? So we're talking about towers and substations and substations, but also things like solar towers and solar farms that are very local and can provide energy, say, to a smaller village or rural area. Those have also been part of some of the projects. And so USAID has been doing this for about, I want to say, I think the Project Power Africa actually was happening prior to the SDG launch, but it's been at least 6 or 7 years that this has been an ongoing project. And there's a short little video put out by USAID, disclaimer, they're going to say they're doing a great job, but still you can kind of get a sense of why they have invested heavily into electricity infrastructure, and to what degree they believe that electricity is critical in development. The SDGs have also encouraged investment in general, and this is just a photograph of conferences that are becoming more widespread, where you know, you have representatives of different countries really trying to create and meet and network with private industries and to really support small businesses as well as medium-sized businesses. And one of the best examples that I can give is how cell phones have really transformed Africa's economy. So the proliferation of mobile phone networks has really transformed communications. And one of the arguments that some people have said is that they haven't had to build landlines, and they don't need to build landlines because now a huge percentage of many Africans now have cell phones. And so it has actually given them an advantage to be able to skip that old landline need for development. At the same time, though, one of the tricky things is there's still not, the infrastructure is not widespread for internet. So for example, only 10% of Africans are internet users, but about 50% have mobile phones. Some are higher percentages than others. And one of the really interesting things around cell phones is that these have largely been, you know, locally created phone companies and or phone apps that have been very country specific, so small scale businesses. And I'm going to ask you guys to look at the ability of cell phones to transform the ability of Africans to really transfer money. And one of the really interesting companies that created one of the first finance apps was called M-Pesa, which is based in Kenya. And M-Pesa is a lot like Venmo or PayPal, where you can just transfer money. But it has revolutionized the lives of many, especially in rural areas, because, for example, it used to take hours to go on a bus to go pay your electricity bill or to deposit money in a bank. And now you can do that through cell phone technology. So people are really talking about its transformative power in terms of development and poverty assistance. So let's kind of end by looking at foreign direct investment. You can see that we're starting to see Africa as a destination for foreign direct investment, but this is a regional average, right? So if you have a sub-Saharan African country that you're following, your country may look like this, or it may look very different, depending, of course, on some of the very local or country-specific characteristics, right? Like you need a peaceful situation, right? You can't be in war and conflict. You need a sense of a stable government. You need that government to be open to foreign direct investment and to be pursuing opportunities for foreign investment. But you can see that over time, especially in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of growth in foreign direct investment, right? In 2000, it was only about $9 billion. 4 years later, it had doubled, right? And now we're looking at about 46 billion. So the money is now starting to flow, which economists would say is a good thing. As a critical geographer, I'm like, well, where is it flowing to and why, right? And it's not flowing evenly into all of the countries. It's flowing into certain economic sectors, mining, oil, and gas, and in some cases, timber extraction. And so it's going to be flowing into those countries where they have those resources, right? So when we look at some of the maps of the top recipients of foreign direct investment, you can see it's countries like, for example, Nigeria, right? Oil exporting countries, as is Angola, right? South Africa doesn't really, South Africa has a much more diverse economy, but it's also, its economy is very different from all of its neighbors for many reasons. But South Africa is considered a very good, strong global South economy, and so it's attracting investment for agricultural reasons. Lots of exports of grapes and fruits, for example. And of course, we know that, for example, China is doing a lot of investment here in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa, looking for things like mining. They're investing also in agricultural exports and timber. And then, of course, everybody's investing in Nigeria for oil, right? So it's a little concerning to see that most foreign direct investment is going towards maybe resource extraction from sub-Saharan Africa rather than maybe investment in other sectors of the economy, in part because that's going to leave a lot of other countries out of this potential area of investment and development. But we are seeing that even in some countries, so some countries are just seeing tremendous economic growth rates, right? Like Ethiopia's growth rate for, I think this is 2018 or 2019, was 12.5%. That's almost 5% higher than China's growth rate, right? So these are this is what people are referring to as the lions are roaring, right? You know, you've got a Nigeria with the 7.5%. Again, a lot of that's oil driven. But even in some countries that maybe don't have a whole lot of resources, like a Rwanda, we're still starting to see some really robust growth. And so this is really kind of an interesting trend to watch. I don't think many economists know yet whether investment is really changing and improving the quality of life for most people in those countries, whether it's had that opportunity yet. So it's something to certainly watch and be a little skeptical of, but also to understand that these are trends that are definitely on the rise. Okay. And when we look at some of the highest performing economies for 2020, you can see that Guyana, Rwanda, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Bhutan are among the highest. Again, some of that is investment from China's Belt and Road. Some of it's just foreign direct investment flowing into these countries in general. And so it's really kind of an interesting map to look at in terms of where some of the hot spots and the not so hot spots are in terms of economic growth for 2020. So the lions are emerging. And there are some of the fastest growing countries right now in terms of GDP growth, which of course is, you know, something that we want to be slightly critical of, because this does not mean that this is just GDP growth overall, right? And this could just be the wealthy getting wealthier and not necessarily jump-starting new jobs and opportunities for everyone in the country, right? So this can still be uneven in terms of inequitable. And we'll just, when you have a chance, go view this video about the lions of Africa and which countries are seeing some of the biggest areas of economic growth and why. So a couple of videos you guys can follow up on as a way to really summarize some of what we've looked at today. All right, so I'm going to ask you guys to get into breakout groups in just a second. Lena's going to put you in random ones, and then you're going to assign yourself into your group numbers. You should know your group numbers by now. Make sure that you open the Google Doc. If you're in groups 1 through 9, there's the Google Doc for you. If you're in groups 10 through 18, there's the Google Doc for you. Nominate your note taker. And then you're going to do, basically there's just 2 questions. One is to look at commodity dependence in your country, right? And the other is to see what's going on with foreign direct investments and debt. So 3 things. So go ahead and, Lena, go ahead and put them in their breakout groups, and then we'll come back in the last 5 minutes to talk about some of what you have discovered for your countries and your region.